using Docker Compose. This particular module I'm going to divide actually into 4 parts. First, we are going to have a very broad overview of what is Docker Compose and what are its features. In part 2, I'm going to show you how we can build a Docker Compose.yml file and use Docker Compose command for execution of an application. In part 3, I am going to show you how we can actually use multiple images for running an application with the help of Docker Compose. And finally, in part 4, I want to discuss about the configuration files and the environmental variables which we want to set in the configuration of an application through Docker Compose. So first thing first, let us understand what is Docker Compose. See, Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running multiple container Docker applications. Yes, there are many instances where we want to have multiple instances of our container running, or probably different containers from different images executing. I may have one container for my web application. I may have one container probably dealing with my database part. One container might be to do with caching. So like that, we can have multiple containers participating in a single application. So it is going to be a tedious process to launch all of these images as containers, basically to launch them as containers, connect them all together, set their environmental variables, and lot of other information which we need to set for each and every container for connecting and communicating between them. All these things can be eased with the help of Docker Compose. So we are going to actually write a Docker Compose file, Docker Compose.yml file, and then use a single command, that is Docker Compose up. And Docker Compose up is going to solve most of our configuration issues in creating an environment for execution of an application. So let us see this once again. Docker Compose is a tool. Basically, it's a command tool for defining and running multi-container Docker applications. With Compose, you are using a YML file to configure your application services. Our application, let us say, is made up of multiple services, and these services can be web application, these services can be caching services, these can be database services. It can be any kind of service which is used in the execution of the application. And then once we configure the YML file, we can simply use a Docker Compose up command, and that will start all the services from a single configuration file. So what actually we are supposed to do by following a catalog of commands. I don't have to refer to some catalog and execute one by one all the commands in order for creating the environment. Yes, one time I'll create a Docker Compose file. I will have everything updated in the Docker Compose file, all the configuration information provided in the Docker Compose file, and one single command will do my job. So the investment of the time would be required only for creation of a Docker Compose file. So using Compose, basically there are 3-step process. Of course, the first step is providing complete information about the application environment with a Docker file. But of course, this is different for different images. For each image, we will need a Docker file for a creation of an image, and eventually the image once created, we can launch that as a container. But then we are going to have multiple images. For each image, we are going to have, let us say, one Docker file. Instead of image, I'll prefer calling it as a service. So for each service which is participating in an application, we are going to have a separate Docker file, and then all the services we are going to define in a single YAML file, Docker Compose YAML file. Why? We are going to run this to create an isolated environment. Docker Compose.yaml is going to be used in background when I say Docker Compose up, and that is going to start and run the complete application. And yes, if needed, for this Docker Compose up command, we can also provide a project name, and with every project name it creates an isolated environment. So this is how actually your Docker Compose.yaml file looks like. Of course, when I type this file, I'll explain more about it. So right now we have services. This is a version of the Docker Compose. Docker Compose by itself is an evolving specification. So you will have to figure out from the documentation what is the current version of YAML, and that you have to mention here. So like right now the latest is 3.4 when I'm recording this. And then we should provide the list of all services. The first service here is the name of the service, which is given as web. Then required for building the service. This is required for port mapping, the host port to the container port. Then you can provide volumes. Whenever you see this hyphen symbol, basically it implies that we are going to have an array of these values. So we have got array of volumes dot on host, current directory of host, map to slash code in the container. Likewise, log volume 01 is mapped to, and what is this? This is bind mount, and this is volume name, and that volume name is supposed to be created over here. Like that, links, yes, the web is linking to Redis. Redis is another image over here, separate service. So there are two services here, web and Redis, and both have their respective images for execution, and two container instances will be created. Out of them, one volume will be created, which will be used by the first one. Blah 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 blah. Not really need to worry about it. I'm going to explain this whole thing line by line. What are the main features of Compose? What makes it effective? Multiple isolated environment on a single host. As I said, Compose file provides a way to document and configure all the application service dependencies. In one single file, you will be able to provide all the dependencies of a service. That means you can mention if your service depends on some database, some queues, some caching, some web application, all these things can be configured at one single place. Using Compose command, Docker Compose up, you can create and start one or more container for each dependency with a single command. And of course, there we can also mention a project name. So same command with different project name can be launched, and each project name can be treated as a separate environment. Docker Compose provides a convenient way to create and destroy the isolated testing environment for your test suite. See, if needed, whenever you want to build your application for production, first we need to do a thorough testing. So you can simply up the environment by using this. -d there means detached. Then you run all your test cases. And when you know that all the test cases have executed successfully, you can simply use down. So whatever has been done here, it will get undone here. That means all the container instances which are created here will be stopped and removed from here. So exact reverse of what is going to happen in up will happen in down. Only recreate containers that have changed. That's the beauty of Docker Compose up. Docker Compose is going to do caching. It is going to cache the configuration used to create the container. So whatever configuration was required for creating the container, it is going to do the caching. Unless that configuration has changed, it is not going to recreate a new instance of the container. Whenever you start the service, it will check the new configuration and the cached configuration are same or not. And if the new configuration of a container and the cached configuration are same, it will simply reuse the existing container. So what is the advantage of reusing the existing container? Basically, it is going to make changes to the environment very quickly. So suppose your application is made up of many containers, you just change one of them. It doesn't have to rebuild and start new container for everything. Only the one which gets modified can be restarted. Yes, Docker Compose will help you to preserve volume data when containers are created. So every time a new container is created, whatever data has been returned to the volume, it can be just retained and reused from the old container. So when Docker Compose up runs, it finds any container from the previous run. It copies the volume from the old container to the new container. And this process ensures that any data you have created in the volume isn't lost. Very important. So you'll be able to continue from where you stopped actually. That's the basic benefit. Variables and moving a composition between environment. See, actually we can have Docker Compose created one for development and one for probably production. We can have a debug build, we can have a release build. And how can we do that? By just having different configuration file. So Compose caches the configuration used to create a container. Oh, sorry, this is repeated. Just delete this. Compose supports variables in Compose file. So when you're going to write a Compose file, you can use variables. And the value of these variables can be set during Docker Compose up or maybe through environmental variables of the operating system. You can use these variables to customize the composition of different environments or maybe for different users. So through variables, composition can be changed. That means multiple environments can be created. And you can also extend a compose file by using extends field, or you can even create a compose command by using multiple compose files. Even this feature is available. Existing compose file can be extended, or in compose up you can mention multiple compose files. So this is a very broad high level discussion about what is Docker Compose. Eventually in the next session I am going to show you how we can actually create a Docker Compose file and use Docker Compose up. Thank you.